Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I snapped awake to the patter of something on a sheet metal roof. My eyes focused slowly on the rafters above, the corners lined with spider webs. A discolored wooden ceiling loomed overhead, and a single window glowed with daylight. The place smelled of stale air and burned wood. Outside, a constant shuffle and the faint scrape of limbs against the cabin walls suggested I was not alone. Only, I had no idea who I was. For what seemed like ages, I stayed absolutely still on a dusty cot. Outside, a low chorus of moans and dragged steps sent chills through every inch of me, though I couldn't recall why. I recognized the sound on some instinctual level, like an echo from deep within memory. Yet no images came to mind. No names, no faces, no recollections of my childhood or how I ended up in this cabin. Even my own name remained missing. There was a rifle against the wall. It leaned near the window, muzzle pointed at the ceiling. A battered rucksack sat on a table half open. I forced myself upright, feeling a strange emptiness where my memories should have been. My limbs moved without protest, as though the body knew what to do even if the mind didn't. Dressed in cargo pants and a weathered jacket, I patted myself down and found no ID, no notes, nothing that explained how I got here. I rose to a crouch and approached the rifle, carefully lifting it to check the safety. My hands did the motions automatically, like muscle memory. R15, I whispered in confusion, noting the model from a faint marking. The barrel looked well maintained. There was a magazine inserted, though I didn't pull it out to count the rounds just yet. Instead, I inched toward the window to peer out. A small clearing spread around the cabin. About 30 yards away, a mix of tall grass and fallen tree limbs formed a rough perimeter, and scattered among those weeds were silhouettes, slow, hunched figures, moving as if disoriented. Their clothes hung in tatters. Some had arms bent at awkward angles. They moved without speaking, though once in a while, one let out a rattling groan. Instinct took over again, warning me to stay out of sight. My stomach felt hollow, the moaning outside, that single continuous note. It triggered something deep within. For a moment, an image sparked. City streets, mass panic, figures slamming into barricades. Then it vanished, like a match snuffed out in darkness. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring it back. Instead, I crept away from the window, letting the battered curtain fall back into place. The cabin was small, a single room with a table, a chair, and the cot I had just left. On the opposite side, a cramped kitchenette held a rusted sink, a portable gas stove, and a few scattered utensils. Beneath the sink, I discovered a single half-full jug of water. 2 unopened cans of soup sat on the counter. It felt like rummaging through a stranger's belongings. The fact that I didn't recall my own name weighed on me. I had no idea where I belonged, whether I had family or friends. But I realized quickly that if I had survived this long in a world that apparently contained these undead creatures, I must have learned a few skills along the way. That knowledge, whatever remained, would be the only ticket to staying alive. I heard a thud against the outer wall. One of them must have stumbled close or picked up on a sound. I froze, rifle in hand, staring at the log wall as if expecting it to burst open. The cabin's boards squeaked under the weight of the figure leaning. With care, I pressed an ear to the door. Shuffling, more moans, then footsteps receding around the corner. The creature must have lost interest. I took the opportunity to examine the rucksack. Inside, I found a folded piece of cloth, possibly a bandana, a small flashlight with a cracked lens, an extra box of ammunition, 20 or so rounds, and some first aid items, bandages, antiseptic wipes, a roll of gauze. Still no journal, no ID, no map. Without more clues, I had only the location itself to examine. A chill wind drifted through a gap in the window frame. Outside, the trees were mostly bare. Judging by the leaves on the ground and a hint of frost on the grass, It might have been late autumn in a temperate region. The cabin walls were made of pine logs. In a corner lay a single battered license plate with faint letters reading NY. Maybe New York. That might place me somewhere in the Adirondacks, or the Catskills, if I had to guess. But how did I know about the Adirondacks or Catskills? The knowledge was there, unbidden, but no context for how or why I knew it. I wondered if there were roads nearby, or maybe a trail. I also realized I needed a plan: food, water, and a secure place to rest. The cabin seemed sturdy enough, but it was far from comfortable, and the presence of the undead was unsettling. If the region was truly overrun, I'd have to move carefully. For an hour, maybe longer, I planned. I tested the door lock. I scouted the single back window. A short wave of a memory flickered. Chain link fences. A group of desperate people pressing their backs to them, warning each other to stay quiet. It vanished as soon as it formed. My breathing grew unsteady. I set my jaw, shouldered the rifle, and braced myself. I had to know what was beyond this clearing. I unlatched the door, pushing it open just wide enough to slip through. The morning light revealed around a dozen of them scattered among the trees and tall grass. Some were missing shoes. Some had mismatched clothing. They staggered aimlessly, as if they sensed something but not its exact location. The mind reeled at the sight, despite my body's calm, practiced movements. I stayed low, rifle clutched, inching along the cabin's outer wall. A single figure was close, wearing what looked like a torn jacket from a bus company uniform, pale face, eyes unfocused. Its left arm was bandaged with filthy cloth. As I took a step, the creature snapped its head toward me. My body tensed. The rifle's muzzle came up in a slow, deliberate arc. The creature let out a rasp, stepping forward. More distant moans rose across the clearing in response. I drew a sharp breath, pivoted, and moved behind the corner of the cabin. No recollection came of how I learned to hold or move with a firearm, yet it felt natural. I took a moment to keep still, letting the creature wander. It bumped into the cabin's wall, but the logs held firm. After a few more lazy steps, it staggered away. There was a gate of rough wire mesh at the perimeter of the clearing, likely some kind of makeshift fence. Maybe I built it. Maybe someone else did. Staying to the perimeter, I slipped along the fence line. Each post was hammered deep into the dirt, linked by wire. It wouldn't hold off a large crowd, but it kept the few outside from wandering too close. My boots left soft prints in the damp soil. When I reached a corner near some thick pines, I spotted an opening in the fence just wide enough to squeeze through. Someone had placed an old padlock there, still undone. The chain hung limp. I crept out, ensuring the moaning group remained behind me. A narrow footpath led uphill into the trees. Overhead, a canopy of pine branches swayed in a breeze, blocking some of the sunlight. At the crest of the hill, the forest opened onto a dirt road. It looked rarely used, with weeds sprouting in cracks and potholes. Fallen leaves coated the surface. If memory served me right, though I had no real idea if memory was correct, these roads might be the old logging trails that run through certain parts of upstate New York. In the distance, I saw the battered remains of a metal sign. Approaching, I made out some letters. Crow, Lake, Mepgrew. It might have once read Crockett Lake Campground or Crow Lake Campground. Hard to tell. The bullet holes and rust obscured the words. But I finally had a clue that I was near a lake area, possibly a state park or a private campground. I scanned the road in both directions. One way ran deeper into the woods, the other dipped downhill where I could see a glint of water through the branches. The presence of water meant possible resources. Fish, fresh supply. Also potential danger if the undead gathered where folks once camped. The choice weighed on me briefly, but caution won out. I decided to see if the lake offered any sign of other survivors or leftover supplies. Heading down the road, I avoided letting my boots crunch too loudly on the gravel. Now and again, my gaze drifted to the trees on either side, wary of movement. A sense of unease prickled with every snap of a twig. yet no direct sign of the undead emerged. After a few hundred yards, I reached a clearing where the lake's surface stretched out, a quiet expanse of grey water. A row of rotting docks lined one side, with small aluminum boats pulled halfway onto shore. A trail sign stood crooked near the water's edge, map faded. One side read, Crown Lake, so that must have been the correct name. Near the docks, a handful of cars sat abandoned in a gravel lot. Most had shattered windows, one had its hood propped open. The place felt like a snapshot of a world left behind. On a whim, I stepped carefully toward the nearest car, a once red SUV. The license plate told me it was from New York too. I tried the door, but it was locked. Leaning in through the busted rear window, I caught sight of a few old jackets and water bottles scattered on the seats. Nothing that looked immediately helpful. The glove box was shut, but to reach it, I'd have to crawl through broken glass. I hesitated for a moment, then tried the hatch in the back. It was jammed, perhaps forced shut during a scuffle or accident. A flicker of memory broke through. A screaming child in a locked SUV, parents banging on the window as something approached. My head spun with questions, but the recollection vanished as soon as it arrived, leaving no answers. My hand twitched on the rifle grip, and I stepped away from the vehicle. Wandering closer to the docks, I found a park office building set on a small hill. The sign above it read, Crown Lake Ranger Station. One window was shattered, and the door hung slightly ajar. As I approached, a pungent odor drifted out, a mix of damp rot and mildew. I paused at the threshold, scanning for movement. The inside was dark, the power obviously long gone. This might be a risky venture, but if I was lucky, I could find keys, maps, maybe even an official radio. I nudged the door open gently, letting a beam of daylight slice across the dusty floor. The interior revealed a small lobby with a reception desk, a wall filled with pamphlets, and a hallway leading deeper into the station. Broken glass and scattered papers littered the floor. Water damage from a leaky roof had warped sections of the ceiling. I took slow steps, rifle at the ready. One of the desks had a nameplate, Ranger Douglas. A coat still hung on the chair. The drawers were half open. I sifted through them, finding a few park maps, an old pair of binoculars with cracked lenses, and a battered notepad with scribbles about daily campground visitors from years ago. Many entries ended abruptly in June 2020, more than 5 years back. Suddenly, I felt a jolt of realization. If that log ended in mid-2020, that might pinpoint the outbreak around that time, give or take. But it was now well beyond that. More than half a decade since civilization's collapse, or so it seemed. Beyond the desk, a locked door labeled Ranger Access Only caught my attention. I tried the knob. It wouldn't budge. A side glance to the desk revealed a ring of keys sitting in a drawer. I grabbed them and shuffled through until I found one labeled Supply. With a click, the door unlocked, revealing a short corridor that opened into a storage room. Inside were metal shelves, boxes of documents, a few maintenance tools, and a locked weapons cabinet along the back wall. My eyes fixed on that cabinet. It had a glass front, though it was reinforced. Through the dusty pane, I glimpsed a lever-action rifle and a pump-action shotgun. Both appeared well-worn but maintained. A smaller shelf beneath them held boxes of ammunition. I tested the cabinet door, locked. The ring of keys clanked in my hand as I searched for a match. Eventually, I found one that clicked. The door swung open with a mild squeak. I reached in and retrieved the shotgun, checking the chamber and magazine tube. Empty. The box of shells next to it offered about 24 shells. A note taped to the inside read, "Use only in emergencies. R. Douglas." I felt a strange pang, imagining Ranger Douglas trying to uphold standard operating procedures, even as society collapsed around them. I contemplated taking the lever-action rifle but decided to sling the shotgun over my shoulder for close encounters and keep the AR-15 for distance. Then I packed a box of shells and a box of .223 ammunition for the AR if I needed to reload. On one shelf, I spotted a battered radio. It was the handheld type Rangers or law enforcement might use, Possibly no signals existed anymore, but it wouldn't hurt to check. I pressed the power button. Nothing happened. The battery might be dead. Searching the supplies netted me a small portable charger. With no electricity, though, I had no immediate way to recharge it, unless I found a vehicle or a solar panel. Before leaving, I noticed a white binder labeled Evacuation Procedures. Inside were typed instructions for the Crown Lake area, detailing rally points in Glens Falls, New York, a city about 40 miles southeast. That was a real place. The document stated, "In the event of a Category 3 outbreak or catastrophic emergency, local authorities will direct survivors to designated shelters in Glens Falls or Albany. If these are compromised, relocation to the secure facility in Saratoga Springs may follow." Words jumped off the page. Outbreak, survivors, secure facility. This was official language, the kind used by emergency management, so it confirmed the outbreak was widely known at one point, with an attempt at organized response. I tucked the binder under my arm. Maybe there would be more clues about my past or the general timeline. Glens Falls. The name rang a bell, but I couldn't place it. Still, it was the nearest lead. Perhaps I could find others or get more supplies there. The road map pinned on the office wall also showed a route. County Road 28 connected to a main highway eventually leading south. As I stepped back into the main lobby, a faint crack echoed from further down the hall. My eyes darted to a darkened door. With the rifle raised, I took a slow step. Another muted noise. A tap, then a shuffling movement. I realized there might be one of them in there, trapped or dozing. The approach was cautious, inch by inch. The door had a window, though grime obscured the view. Inside, I could make out a shape slumped against a file cabinet. Torn clothing. No movement. Yet a sudden flick of a limb suggested it wasn't fully at rest. Part of me wanted to turn and leave, but if it followed me out or attracted more, that could be worse. The door hinges made a faint rasp as it opened. The figure stirred. A ranger hat lay on the floor nearby. It turned slowly, revealing a face with darkened eyes. One of its legs was twisted beneath it, as if broken, preventing it from standing properly. The creature lifted a hand towards me. The stench of decay hit me, and I recoiled. Without thinking, I raised the barrel. My hands trembled. The undead ranger let out a rasp and tried to crawl closer. I found myself pressing the trigger before I fully realized it. The muzzle flashed. The noise reverberated through the small office like a thunderclap, echoing down the halls. The figure collapsed, unmoving. Smoke curled from the barrel. I stood there, mind churning. A wave of revulsion threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I glanced at the name tag on the uniform. Douglas. The realization sank in that I had just ended the reanimated existence of Ranger Douglas, whose name had been on the desk. The same person who had tried to maintain order here. Something inside me twisted. I never wanted to cause harm, but if Douglas had been trapped this way for 5 years, I could hardly wrap my mind around it. This was survival. That's what I kept telling myself. Yet a part of me sensed there had been times in my past where I had to do things like this. Perhaps that was why I had no trouble operating the firearm. Perhaps that was why I couldn't remember. Maybe my mind had shielded itself. Knowing the gunshot might draw attention, I gathered my resolve and hurried out, stepping carefully around broken glass. Outside, the day seemed darker despite the sunlight. The moaning along the tree line had grown louder. A couple of them staggered into view around the visitor parking lot, heads jerking at any movement. I stayed low, weaving between abandoned cars. Several times I paused, letting them wander ahead or run into a fence. Their sense of direction seemed poor, but if they caught a glimpse of me, they'd move with alarming focus. Eventually, I broke away from the lot and made my way back up the dirt road, guided by the faint memory of the path. The presence of the new shotgun felt reassuring, though the reality of using it weighed on me. One shot had been enough. The entire scenario felt like I was reading the last pages of a tragic history. Returning to the cabin proved more challenging with the noise I'd made at the ranger station. A cluster of them lingered near the fence, drawn by the sound. I studied them from the cover of the trees. They shuffled aimlessly, hands brushing the wire mesh. If I tried going through the gap, they'd see. I took a wide arc around the perimeter, creeping through thick brush. My jacket snagged on brambles, but I managed to circle back to the cabin's rear side. Once inside, I set the binder on the table and leaned the shotgun in a corner. My pulse raced from the tension. In silence, I barricaded the door with a heavy stool and retreated to the cot. Then I noticed a faint scuff mark on the floor near the wall. Leaning in close, I realized a small square hatch was hidden beneath a rug. Curiosity spiked. Lifting the rug, I found a latch. It led to a narrow crawl space under the cabin. Moving the cot aside, I pried the hatch open. A ladder descended into darkness. My flashlight flickered dimly when I tried to power it on. Low battery. The beam cast just enough light to see dusty beams, scattered boxes, and a wooden crate or two. After checking that the coast was clear, I climbed down. The space smelled musty, as though no one had been down here in ages. Stacked against one wall were boxes labeled Canned Goods, 2021, and Tools. Another box read Personal, marked in thick black marker. Inside the personal box, I found something that jolted me. A folded piece of lined paper with a list of names and single-sentence notes next to them. R. Lewis, left for Albany, never returned. K. Jensen, injured at the blockade near Lake George. M. Baker, moved south with group from Utica. Unknown, found wandering near cabin. Memory issues? The last line made me pause. Was that me? It said memory issues, as if someone discovered me wandering. Whoever wrote this, maybe the occupant of the cabin, had encountered me. Why had they not left more details? I rummaged deeper. A battered camera sat at the bottom of the box, the battery obviously dead. The screen was cracked. No help there. Beneath it lay a dog-eared road atlas with circled points: Albany, Glens Falls, Syracuse, Rochester, and lines connecting them. Notes in the margins read, route unsafe, bridge collapsed, ferry no longer operational. It looked like someone had done extensive traveling. The final note read, cabin == fallback, stock with supplies. It began to make sense. Possibly I had ended up at this fallback cabin with them, whoever them was. And at some point, I lost my memory, maybe from a head injury or some trauma. That person could have left me behind, or maybe they never returned. The question was, where did they go? I climbed back up, mind brimming with questions. If the outbreak had started around 2020, and now it was at least 5 years later, the world might be a scattered ruin of survivors. The binder from the ranger station suggested a plan that probably collapsed long ago. My best lead was to follow the path toward Glens Falls. That might be the only way to find clues or maybe run into other people. Settling onto the cot, I grabbed one of the soup cans from the kitchenette and used a manual can opener I found in a drawer. The taste was bland, but it filled me enough to focus on reading more of the binder by lantern light. Words like Z-virus, CDC, national emergency, quarantine zones peppered the text. They mentioned that the infection spread through bodily contact, possibly bites. Once infected, a person turned in a matter of hours. The official stance was to maintain strict quarantine protocols and rely on designated safe zones for organized defense. Then I spotted a line. The largest safe zone in eastern New York is rumored to be in Schenectady, but communication is sporadic. Another note read, unconfirmed reports of partial containment in Toronto. The language was always uncertain, suggesting no guarantee. It struck me that if more than 5 years had passed, these zones might no longer exist. As I set the binder down, my gaze fell on my hands. They were calloused with faint scars. One scar in particular traced a small line across my left palm. In that moment, another memory flickered. Kneeling on a wet sidewalk, pressing my palm against broken glass as I scrambled under a fence. Someone shouted my name. I could almost hear it. But again, the memory slipped away before I grasped the name. A wave of frustration welled up, and I pinched the bridge of my nose. My mind felt like a puzzle with half its pieces missing. After a few days of careful planning and quiet observation of the undead around the cabin, I decided it was time to move on. The fence kept them at bay for the most part, but I suspected my supplies wouldn't last indefinitely. The soup, water, and random canned goods hidden below the cabin might keep me going for a while, but the thought of living out my days alone, with no memory, felt unbearable. I gathered everything I deemed essential: the AR-15 and the shotgun, extra ammunition, a couple of cans, the binder of notes, and the road atlas. I stuffed them all in the rucksack. My plan was to follow the road south toward Glens Falls. Perhaps I'd find a sign of life there, or at least scavenge more supplies. Before leaving, I hesitated. The cabin might have been my only truly safe hideout, but a sense of purpose, of finding answers, urged me onward. That morning, the undead were sparser near the fence. I slipped through the gap quietly, stepping over fallen limbs and rotting leaves. The crisp air suggested late October or early November. The sky was slate grey. Clouds threatened rain. My path led back toward Crown Lake, then onto the main roads indicated in the binder. Here and there, I passed old cabins, collapsed tents, and vehicles left rusting along the shoulders. A skeleton of a small convenience store stood about a mile from the campground entrance. The windows were smashed, the inside shelves long picked over. I found a half-dozen water bottles in the back, dusty but sealed. Each discovery felt like a small victory. As the day wore on, I put miles behind me, weaving between abandoned cars on narrow highways. Road signs appeared. To Route 9N, Lake George Village 15 miles, Glens Falls 25 miles. The presence of these familiar place names stirred something inside me. It was like crossing back into a life I once knew, but everything felt foreign, yet my footsteps carried me onward. Late in the afternoon, drizzle began to fall, making the asphalt slick. I spotted a large billboard promoting an amusement park, The Great Escape, Lake George. The cheerful cartoon characters felt eerie in this silent landscape. I decided to find shelter before nightfall. Nearby, a derelict motel stood behind a row of pines. The sign read Lakeview Inn, though there was no lake in sight. A handful of the undead loitered in the parking lot. I crouched behind a bush, watching. They moved aimlessly, drifting around broken cars. I realized I needed to clear a path if I wanted to rest in the motel. With the AR-15, I could take them from a distance, but the sound would draw more. The shotgun was even louder. Instead, I decided on a stealthier approach. Drawing a long hunting knife from my belt, another item I discovered in the cabin's stash, I eased toward the first figure. It wore a thick jacket with a patch that might have once read "Maintenance Staff." As I approached from behind, I gripped the back of its collar and thrust forward. It collapsed in a lifeless heap without a cry, leaving a wave of revulsion in its wake. The second creature took a few steps before I repeated the action, catching it before it noticed. Soon, the lot lay quiet. I wiped the blade on the jacket of one of the fallen creatures, a trembling motion in my fingers. Survival demanded it, I reminded myself. The alternative was to be overrun in the night. The motel's door to the main office was jammed. I gave it a firm push, and it opened with a scrape. Dust and darkness greeted me. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Flashlight in hand, I scanned the counter, shelves, and a door leading to a back office. Everything was ransacked. Old flyers and keys lay scattered. One battered ledger behind the counter showed check-ins from 5 years ago. The final entry was dated June 15th, 2020, someone named Ramirez, stopping for the night. I found a key labeled Room 12. I made my way outside to the row of rooms. Most doors were ajar. Room 12 was shut, though. The key slid into the lock and the knob turned. Inside, I discovered a small, shabby room with peeling wallpaper and a single bed. There was no sign of a struggle, just a thick layer of dust. I propped a chair against the door and placed a small mirror I'd found on the floor so I could see any movement outside. Then, setting my rucksack down, I tried to rest. The memory flashes came again. Dark alleys, a swirl of emergency lights, the sound of alarms echoing, and a half-glimpsed shape wearing a protective suit with CDC emblazoned on the back. I wondered if I'd been involved in emergency services, or if I was just an unlucky bystander. Sleep arrived in fits and starts. Morning came with a pale sun peeking through broken curtains. I scoured the motel again, discovering a vending machine near the pool area. The front glass was smashed, but behind the metal flap, I managed to retrieve a couple of stale snack bars. Every bit helped. Continuing south, I noticed the presence of the undead grew more frequent. On the highway, small clusters stumbled near crashed vehicles, some pinned beneath wreckage. The condition of the roads suggested a chaotic evacuation years ago, with cars piled up, caked in rust. Trees and vines grew through windshields. The line between civilization and wilderness blurred. In the early afternoon, I came across a billboard with bold letters, "Safe zone, checkpoint ahead, stay in vehicle." Beneath it, someone had spray-painted, "Abandoned, turn back." Still, I pressed on, partly driven by the hope that not all signs of safety were false. Eventually, I reached a barricade of concrete blocks and rusted cars on the outskirts of Glens Falls. A wide sign read, "Stop, military quarantine." Tattered tarps and barbed wire lined the top. A few canopies stood beyond, presumably used for screening evacuees. The place seemed deserted now. My steps slowed as I approached. Some fences were knocked down. Bullet casings littered the ground. No bodies remained, though. Perhaps they had been cleared out or taken elsewhere. I climbed over a low segment of collapsed fence, stepping into what appeared to be the remains of a checkpoint. Overturned tables, scattered pamphlets warning of Z-virus, and a couple of medical kits lay in the dust. I checked the kits, mostly empty, aside from a few bandages and a single bottle of disinfectant. Then I pressed onward into the city. Glens Falls was far from a major metropolis, but it had enough large buildings, shops, and residential areas to create an oppressive landscape of abandoned vehicles and silent streets. Up ahead, a cracked sign marked "Hospital." My eyes flicked to the binder's mention of a possible shelter in a local medical facility. That was years ago, though. Could there be anything left? As I navigated downtown, a half-flooded street forced me to detour. Broken windows and dark storefronts gave no sign of life. Occasionally, a figure would shuffle out from behind a ruined bus stop or stagger out of a doorway. Each time, I either skirted around them or dispatched them quietly if they blocked my path. My clothing picked up layers of grime from the alleyways. At one intersection, I spotted a flicker of movement. A person? My pulse quickened. I pressed myself against a brick wall, peering around the corner. Yes, definitely a living person, clad in a hooded jacket, rummaging in what looked like an abandoned cafe. Their posture was alert, scanning the street now and then. A rush of conflicting instincts nearly pinned me in place. Part of me wanted to call out, to see if they were friendly. Another part, shaped by caution, warned me they might react with aggression. Finally, I cleared my throat softly from a distance, letting my presence be known without startling them at close range. They froze, then pivoted, one hand disappearing under their jacket. Maybe they had a weapon. I raised a palm in a gesture that I hoped looked non-threatening. "Hello," I said, voice low. "Not looking for trouble. Are you alone?" They glanced around, then stepped into the open, revealing a pistol gripped at their side. The figure, a man in his 40s with close-cropped hair, studied me, eyes narrowed. He wore a patch on his jacket that read, "Lincoln County Sheriff," but it was faded. He cleared his throat. "You're the first person I've seen in a while," he said, keeping the pistol at the ready. "Are you infected?" I shook my head. "No, just trying to survive." My voice trembled with uncertainty. "I'm heading to... well, I'm not even sure. I heard about a safe zone. Might be old info. He lowered the pistol slightly, though he kept it in his hand. Most of those safe zones collapsed, from what I've heard. The last rumor was that Plattsburgh had a functioning camp, but that was a while back. I remembered the mention of Schenectady in the binder. What about Schenectady? I asked. He shrugged. I was there 2 years ago. Place was overrun. Some folks said Albany was better protected, but I never made it. He eyed my gear. You look well armed, but you're not wearing any militia insignia. Not with a group? I shook my head. The question of groups or militias felt foreign. Maybe I'd once been with a group and lost them. I decided to be partially honest. I can't recall much of anything. Woke up in a cabin north of here. No memories. He studied my face as if trying to decide whether to believe me. Then he lowered the pistol further. I'm Tom Hayes, he said simply. Used to be a deputy sheriff near Buffalo before everything fell apart. Came east looking for family. That didn't pan out. I considered giving a name in return but realized I had none to offer. I don't know my name, I said quietly. He paused, sympathy flickering in his expression. Memory trouble, huh? I've met a couple folks like that. Could be trauma, a head injury, or something else. Well, I'm out here alone too. He looked around at the silent streets. You're welcome to join me for a bit if you want. I can't promise safety, but it's better than wandering alone. We ended up inside the cafe, scanning the shelves for anything edible. The place was picked over. Broken pastry cases, empty coolers. Under the counter, Tom discovered a box of bottled seltzer water. We each took one, sipping carefully. The fizz stung my tongue, a strange sensation. During the conversation, Tom explained he was heading toward a rumored settlement near Vermont, in the Lake Champlain region. Heard they have a small farming community, walls, real leadership. Could be just another story, but I've got to try. He eyed me. You're welcome to come along, or we can part ways, no hard feelings. I weighed my options. The binder's mention of Schenectady didn't seem promising, and traveling alone was dangerous. Tom at least seemed calm, ex-law enforcement, and had decent gear. I'll come with you, I agreed, at least until we find something better. That night, we holed up in an apartment above the cafe. It had a couple of intact doors and a second-story vantage point. We barricaded the stairwell with furniture. Tom kept watch for a while, then woke me to swap shifts. During my watch, I glanced through the apartment's scattered belongings. Picture frames turned face down, children's toys, a dusty phone left in a corner. My mind felt like it was on the cusp of remembering everything, but a heavy fog refused to lift. Over the next week, Tom and I made our way east along back roads, skirting the major highways. Sometimes we used an old SUV we found with a workable battery, though it didn't last long before we ran out of fuel. Along the route, we passed gutted towns with crumbling infrastructure. We saw the skeletal remains of a supermarket, the parking lot cracked by weeds, carts rusted in place. A few times, we spotted movement in the distance that wasn't undead, maybe other survivors, but they kept away, just as wary as we were. Tom shared pieces of his story, how the outbreak spread faster than anyone expected, how major cities became impossible to hold. He mentioned that Buffalo tried to fortify a perimeter, but the infected overwhelmed it. The National Guard was deployed early in the crisis, but their lines broke when tens of thousands tried to flee or got infected. Tom never found his relatives. He believed they headed south toward Pennsylvania, but the roads were jammed, and he lost track. He survived by drifting from one group to another, eventually ending up alone. The more he talked, the more tiny sparks ignited in my memory, like hearing a half-forgotten lullaby. I recalled glimpses of a setting sun over a city skyline, men in uniform shouting orders. I recalled driving at night, headlights reflecting off a green highway sign for Syracuse. None of it gave me my name or my past profession, but it told me I'd been in New York when everything fell apart. At one point, We camped near an old radio tower outside Queensbury. Tom scoured the control shed for parts and managed to power up a small generator, hoping to broadcast a signal. We typed a short message on a ham radio console, but only static hissed in response. We tried scanning frequencies, hearing faint fragments of voices, but they were too garbled to understand. He left the generator running for a few hours, broadcasting, "If you can hear this, survivors near Lake George area, heading east. Coordinates." Then the coordinates. No answer came. On a cold morning near the Vermont border, we stumbled upon a group of travelers on a back road. 3 people, 2 men and 1 woman, armed with hunting rifles. Immediately, our guard went up, but instead of confrontation, they hailed us. The woman introduced herself as Lisa. They were heading to the same rumored settlement near Lake Champlain. "Heard they got farmland, solar power, even a doctor," she said. "Name's Redwood Farm or Redwood Community." We decided to join forces, safety in numbers. Over the next few days we traveled together, and I noticed I felt more at ease around them. A sense of normalcy returned, small jokes or shared tasks. One of the men, Drake, was once an EMT in Saratoga Springs. He spoke knowledgeably about medical procedures and made sure we all checked for any sign of infection after close calls. During one night around a campfire, as we listened to the wind whisper through pine branches, Lisa asked about my story. Tom briefly explained my memory loss. Drake frowned, mulling it over. "There were cases of folks with severe psychological trauma after everything collapsed," he said. "I treated a few who couldn't remember entire events. The stress alone can wipe memories, but sometimes the memories trickle back." He patted my shoulder. "Give it time." Time seemed to be the only solution, but the fragments of memory that did return were jarring. Each new recollection made me question who I'd been. Did I have a family? Was I searching for them too? The uncertainty was almost as bad as not knowing at all. We pressed on for a couple more days until we reached the outskirts of a small settlement near a rural highway. Hand-painted signs warned, "Keep back, we have guards." A tall chain-link fence surrounded what looked like a cluster of farm buildings. Beyond it, fields extended across a low valley, dotted with a few livestock. We saw smoke rising from a chimney, which meant someone was definitely home. A voice called out from a watchtower near the fence. "State your business." Tom raised his hands in a show of peace. "We're just travelers, looking for safety and a place to help out if we can." After a tense exchange, the gate opened. We entered Redwood Community, a ramshackle but functional settlement of about 20 people. They had a communal garden, a few solar panels salvaged from who knows where, and a generator for emergencies. A man in his 50s wearing a straw hat introduced himself as Addison Rourke, the unofficial leader. He eyed us carefully, then welcomed us to share a meal and prove we posed no threat. Redwood had a strict policy about contraband or dangerous behavior. Over dinner, we learned Redwood had been around for a couple of years, slowly expanding as they took in survivors. They lived off the land, hunted deer, kept a few goats, and traded with neighboring pockets of people. But Addison warned that the roads were still unsafe, and the undead weren't the only threat. Some groups had turned to looting or worse. Redwood had built defensive fences around a big chunk of farmland to keep them out. For the first time since I woke up in that cabin, I felt a sliver of hope. Seeing an actual community that functioned with gardens, routine chores, even a semblance of social structure. It was more than I'd imagined possible. People greeted each other by name. Children played with improvised toys. Even the ever-present caution around the perimeter guards didn't dampen the feeling that life was here, continuing despite everything. I stayed in Redwood for a week, maybe 2. The days blurred as I helped with chores, tending goats, patrolling the fences, assisting Drake in the makeshift clinic. Once, while organizing medical supplies, I picked up a bottle of antiseptic with a label from Albany Medical Center. A wave of recognition passed over me. I saw an image of hospital hallways, me wearing scrubs or some kind of medical attire. Did I work there? Or was I treated there? I pressed a hand to my temple, trying to focus. A voice in my memory said, "Doctor, we need you in triage." But it faded. If I had been a doctor or a nurse, maybe that was why I knew some of the procedures Drake showed me. But still, the pieces wouldn't fully click. Drake noticed my distraction and asked if I was all right. I could only nod, uncertain. As life settled into a routine at Redwood, I questioned whether to remain there or continue searching. I still had no firm grasp on my identity. I started going by Doc, a nickname the others gave me because I seemed to have some medical insight. It felt strange, but no other name had emerged. Tom, on the other hand, decided to stay, seeing Redwood as a safe haven. He'd had enough wandering. Lisa and Drake, however, planned to move on eventually, searching for rumored communities in other states. They said Redwood was great, but they had relatives who might be in New England. One evening they asked me if I wanted to join. I hesitated. Part of me longed to find the final pieces of my past. Another part enjoyed Redwood's stability. That night, I tried to sleep, but couldn't. The wind rattled the window of the small bunkhouse Redwood assigned me. Outside, the watchtower lantern cast shifting shadows. Lying awake, I remembered the cabin north of Crown Lake, the notes about Albany and Schenectady. Something inside me whispered that if I truly wanted closure, I should visit Albany Medical Center. If that mental image of hospital halls was genuine, maybe I had worked there. Maybe I'd find records or someone who remembered me. The next morning, I approached Addison and explained my plan to head south. He warned me it was a long trek, with no guarantee of success. "Albany got hit hard," he said. "Heard it was chaotic, but we won't stop you. Take some supplies and a couple of spare magazines if you need them." Tom tried to convince me to stay, concerned for my well-being. But I made up my mind. I wanted answers, even if they were buried in a ruined city. Lisa and Drake had other plans, so I'd be traveling alone again. That thought unsettled me, but Redwood agreed to let me borrow a battered motorcycle they had salvaged, provided I promised to bring it back if I survived. It was a small off-road bike with limited fuel, but it might cut days off my journey. Leaving Redwood felt like stepping off a cliff. Outside those fences, the world returned to a wasteland of broken highways and scattered undead. I rode the motorcycle carefully along back roads, swerving around rusted vehicles. The engine noise risked attracting attention, so I stuck to routes Addison marked on a hand-drawn map. It led me through farmland, around clogged intersections, and across an old covered bridge near Schuylerville. The days shortened as late autumn deepened. Each evening I found a defensible spot, sometimes a rooftop, sometimes a barn, where I could hide the bike and rest. The nights were uneventful except for distant howls and the rustle of leaves in the wind. On the third day, I saw the skyline of Albany in the distance, or what remained of it. Tall buildings rose from behind the Hudson River. Smoke or haze hung over parts of the city. Crossing the outskirts, I found military barriers similar to those in Glens Falls, but far larger. A pair of rusted tanks and a line of razor wire told the story of a major defensive operation that had failed. Beyond lay city streets littered with abandoned buses, burned cars, entire blocks that had collapsed. The epicenter of the outbreak must have been catastrophic here. I parked the motorcycle in a discreet alley. On foot, with my rucksack, I navigated the rubble toward Albany Medical Center. Street signs were battered, but enough remained to guide me. More than once, I ducked behind debris to avoid roaming packs of the undead. They moved in tighter clumps here, possibly drawn by the concentration of what had once been a large population. Finally, I saw the hospital complex, multiple towers of concrete, windows shattered. In some places, the facade had collapsed entirely. The emergency entrance sign was still half lit by a flickering generator. That was unexpected, possibly indicating a leftover power source, but it also meant the place could be unstable. I eased inside through a side door. Hallways smelled of disinfectant gone stale, old blood and mold. Medical gurneys lay overturned. I tried to keep my steps light. Occasionally, I heard distant moans echoing from the upper floors. I followed the signage to the administrative offices, hoping to find old records or maybe a staff directory. Near the main reception area for staff, I pushed open a door labeled Human Resources. Cabinets were thrown open, papers scattered everywhere. At least it wasn't pitch black. A skylight overhead let in some grey daylight. Rifling through drawers felt wrong, but I pressed on. Then, in one drawer, I spotted a folder labeled Emergency Staffing, Spring 2020. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. Names, positions, Idaho photos. Halfway through, I paused on a mugshot of a man with brown hair, mid-30s, identified as Dr. James Alton, resident physician. The face looked familiar. My reflection in the dusty window was unkempt, hair longer, cheeks hollow. But the bone structure was close enough that it felt like I was looking at an older version of that photo. I leaned against the desk, struggling to process it. James Alton. Could that be me? A swirl of memories flooded in. A white coat, the rush of answering calls in the ER, chaos as patients overwhelmed the hospital, staff wearing face shields and masks. I remembered running to triage with a stethoscope in hand. Fear and confusion among the staff as the infected poured in. The moment I pressed my palm against broken glass in a frantic attempt to secure a door. The recollection of a nurse screaming for help. It was all there, behind a thin fog, but coming into focus. I sank into a nearby chair, staring at the photo. Dr. James Alton. Born in Rochester, graduated from a medical program in 2019, joined Albany Medical Center as a resident. That was the official record. It matched the bits and pieces that had haunted me. Yet the file ended with a note. Missing after the quarantine breach, presumed dead or infected. I thought about how I might have escaped amid the chaos, eventually fleeing north, losing everything in the process. A sense of profound sadness and relief mingled in me. I had a name, I had a past, but everyone I knew, colleagues, friends, maybe family, were likely gone or scattered. The hospital halls were silent now, haunted by the memory of what once was. I carefully tucked the file into my rucksack. A loud crash from somewhere down the corridor made me rise. Possibly, one of the undead had knocked over something, drawn by my rummaging. I decided not to linger. Exiting the HR office, I hurried back through the labyrinth of corridors, avoiding open hallways. A few times I peered around corners to see silhouettes stumbling in white coats or patient gowns. The emptiness of their eyes hammered home that I might have known some of them once. Outside, the late afternoon sky glowed with a dull light. I slipped through the side door, scanned the street, and sprinted back to the alley where I'd left the motorcycle. As I rode away, weaving around debris, a swirl of recollections merged with the reality of a ruined city. The final puzzle piece. My name is James Alton. I had been a doctor at Albany Medical Center when the outbreak swelled into a full-blown catastrophe. Over the following days, I made my way back north, not entirely sure why. Perhaps Redwood community felt like the closest thing to home now. Or maybe I just needed to share my discovery with someone who cared. The city, for all its significance, offered no true solace. The roads outside Albany were as empty as before, aside from the undead and the echoes of a lost world. When I finally crossed back into Redwood's perimeter, Addison was there, alongside Tom, who was stunned to see me alive. "Welcome back," he said, offering a handshake. I parked the bike and handed over the file. Tom skimmed it, reading the name. "Dr. James Alton," he said quietly, a look of mild awe on his face. "So, we should call you James now?" I considered it, then nodded. "James Alton. It feels right." That night, sitting near the communal fire, I shared what I remembered. The images came in bursts, lines of infected patients, the frantic nights in the ER, glimpses of a city in chaos. I told them about the HR office, the note that declared me missing. Drake, who was also there at Redwood temporarily, patted my shoulder. "Well, Doc, or James, You're definitely not missing anymore. In the days that followed, I applied whatever medical knowledge lingered in my mind to help Redwood's small clinic. Slowly, the skills returned, diagnosing infections, stitching wounds, prescribing rest for overworked farmers. Each success felt like reclaiming another piece of my old self. I sometimes thought about traveling to see if any family remained in Rochester, but Addison's scouts reported that the highways there were severely compromised. For now, Redwood was safe enough to call home. Perhaps one day, I'd gather a team and make the journey west. For now, my place was among these people, working to rebuild a shard of civilization. Every so often, I recalled the day I woke in that fortified cabin with no memories. The lonely sense of displacement still lingered, but now it was tempered by purpose. I wasn't just an anonymous survivor anymore. I had a name, a past, and a future. Even in a world overrun by the undead, that knowledge lit a small spark of hope. And so I made peace with my fragmented history. I carried the scars, physical and otherwise. I carried the rifle, the shotgun, the supplies. I carried the faint echo of heartbreak for what had been lost, and the cautious optimism for what might yet be regained. Most importantly, I carried my name, Dr. James Alton, forward into whatever came next. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.